Hello, let's talk religion.
I've been thinking lately about the question of who is religious. I mean, we all have this idea of what a religious person looks like or what he or she acts like, but is it really that simple? Sure, religious is just a word that we've invented, and so however we define that word also defines what a religious person is. But the problem is that people define this word very differently, and thus there is a lot of misunderstanding and confusion about this. When does a person become religious? Like, where's the line drawn? Is there a scale? And if so, what does that scale look like? If you've seen my previous video on religion, you'll know that there is no official definition for that word. And needless to say, the same applies for the word religious as well. We don't like to use that word academically at all because of how problematic it can be. I mean, think about this. We like to consider Saudi Arabia a very religious country, right? I mean, it's a Muslim country, the laws are very strict, the women are usually veiled, and so on. But is Saudi Arabia really a very religious country, or does Saudi Arabia just follow a more strict interpretation of Islam? I mean, there's a difference there. See, this is where the problem often arrives. Here in the West, where we consider ourselves to be very secularized, we often associate more religion with more strict, right? So the more religious a person is, the more strict he is, or the more religious a person is, the less open-minded he is. To put it in other words, more religion equals bad and less religion equals good. But isn't this just our Western secularized view that religion is somehow opposed to the ideals of modern society, that religion is associated with old ideas and something that represents a bygone world? Are we still really feeling the effects of the Enlightenment when religion and all its expressions were considered to be in opposition to everything we wanted to achieve as a society? I mean, is it really true that if you are more religious, then you are necessarily more strict or more rigid? Let's take an example. So let's say there are two women, and both of these women are Christians. So they grew up in a Christian family, they live in a Christian country, and so on. The first woman, let's call her Linda, she lives a rather strict life. She doesn't go out much, she doesn't drink any alcohol, she dresses very modestly, and she always wears a crucifix. And all of this because she thinks that's what's appropriate for a Christian woman. The second woman, and her name will be Sarah, she doesn't do any of these things. She goes out, she drinks alcohol, she dresses and acts like any other person on the street. But every night before she goes to bed, she prays for 15 minutes, she always goes to church on Sundays, and when she's feeling down, she reads the Bible for comfort. Now, which of these two women would you say is more religious? Let's take another example. Two Muslim guys. One is this stereotypical Muslim dude. Like he wears the long white Muslim garb, he has a long beard, he doesn't think women should be able to drive because Islam says so, he thinks music is forbidden because Islam says so. He's very keen to follow the Sharia, and he encourages others to do so as well. But he doesn't always pray 5 times a day, and he has never really read the Quran in its entirety. Now the other guy, he lives in Germany, he dresses in Western clothing, he is a feminist, and sometimes on weekends he plays at the local clubs with his metal band. But he never misses a prayer, and he does dhikr 1 time a week, and he's always thinking about God. Now, which of these two men would you say is more religious or more Muslim? Here we're kind of getting into the territory of what religion actually is. We discussed this briefly in a previous episode about religion and explained that religion can mean very different things to different people, and people have different ideas about what the core of religion is. So for example, if you think religiosity is mainly a personal belief or faith, then you adhere to a very Protestant Christian idea of religion and religiosity. While other cultures or regions of the world may sort of emphasize the more external aspects like family or behavior or law or politics or whatever to be the core of religion and religiosity. We often hear about a kind of identity crisis that appear in minority communities as a result of this kind of understanding. So a Muslim woman, for example, may often feel that she has to hide her religiosity in order to fit into society. People have a tendency to believe that you are more Muslim if you wear a hijab, for example, and this creates a kind of dichotomy between Islam and Western culture, where the former is seen as being in opposition to the latter. The more a person goes against the norms of Western society, the more Muslim they are in this case. And this isn't necessarily true at all, but this kind of dichotomy sort of often leads to things like bigotry and ultimately racism as well. But this leads me to another related subject. Like anyone with good taste in music, I really love the Beatles. It's a group of just really great songwriters and one really good drummer. But it's no secret that their lead guitarist, George Harrison, throughout his life was very much interested and into Hinduism. There are Beatles songs that, like Within You, Without You, that clearly express philosophies related to Vedanta and things like that. The time will come when you see we're all one and life flows on within you and without you, and so on. Especially after the Beatles, in his solo material, this could be seen. And his album Living in the Material World is almost exclusively made up of devotional songs to the divine. But there are a lot of different opinions about this, not just if people like or don't like this direction he took, but also what it means and what it actually is that he's doing. Well, I personally wouldn't hesitate to call George Harrison a very religious person. There are a lot of people who say that he's just philosophical or he's just spiritual. But what's the difference here, really? There seems to be this idea in the West that Eastern religions like Hinduism or Buddhism are often more spiritualities than they are religions, and people practicing it are more spiritual than religious. One reason for this could be that these religions like Buddhism, when they are imported to the West and a Western market, are often de-religionized. That is, main aspects of those religions that we would consider religious are often removed from them when they are imported to the Western market. So the kind of Buddhism practiced by a Swedish convert may be completely different from one practiced by an Indian or someone in China. Another factor could be that we here in the West so strongly associate the word religion with the Judeo-Christian Islamic framework, and so this becomes the framework by which all other religions are measured as well in their sort of scale of religiosity or scale of how much of a religion they are. I mean, yeah, George Harrison's songs are very philosophical, but those philosophies are usually directly linked to religious teachings within Hinduism, and so doesn't that make them religious? This apparent dichotomy between religious and spiritual is very interesting. A lot of people claim that religion is indeed going away in the West, church attendance is getting lower, and so on. But it's actually a lot more complicated than this. It is true that people in Sweden, for example, have been moving away from Christian dogmas in their institutionalized forms, but does this necessarily make them less religious? In a book that came out 3 years ago, historian of religions David Thurfjell writes the following. In terms of faith and philosophy, Swedes have gone through a change away from institutionalized Christianity and its dogmas, but they have not abandoned a religious way of approaching existence. Actually, some research have shown that things like belief in an afterlife have actually increased, and the number of people who don't believe in a god or supernatural power or force decreased between the years 1981 and 1997. This is all in Sweden, by the way. Sweden also ranks second in all of Europe when it comes to number of people believing in some sort of spirit or life force, and that God is something that lives within us rather than outside, in spite of it commonly being considered one of the most secularized countries in the world. This is perhaps best exemplified when you ask someone if they are religious or what they believe in, especially in Sweden. It is very likely that you will get an answer like, oh, I'm spiritual but not religious, or I believe in something, but maybe not the god of religions, and so on. This is a very common answer. But in certain situations, like a crisis or a national tragedy or things like this, we can clearly see that people start sort of falling back on their traditional religious values and practices. In this case, a Christian tradition. So it's a very complicated situation, let's say. It seems that if we define religious as specific adherence to a institutionalized religion and its theology, then indeed it appears that it's decreasing in a way. But if we define the word more broadly, then it certainly is not that simple. People clearly still believe in things that appear irrational or sometimes supernatural. We can see this in, for example, the emergence of the New Age movements, or the sort of renewed interest in Eastern religions that aren't considered religious in the same way. What do you think? What does religious actually mean? Who is religious? And is there a difference between spiritual and religious? leave a comment and we can continue this discussion there. And I'll see you next time. Bye.